Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of the Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and for today's instalment I speak with Evvie of Emergence Phoenix, a commitment to ecologies of liberation rising from the legacy of Indigenous African ancestors. Evvie is an activist who advocates for marginalised community groups and will be speaking at this year's annual International Cultic Studies Association conference, or ICSA, in June of 2022. Before we get started on today's episode, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Heather, who has increased her pledge on patreon.com this week. She is now a top-tier supporter, and 10% of Heather's monthly pledge will go to Breaking Code Silence, a non-profit dedicated to telling the stories of troubled teen survivors and for making change. Thank you to Heather. And thank you to the person who donated to the show this week. All of this support allows for this show to continue and to get more survivor stories into the public eye. Don't forget that CrimeCon tickets are 10% off if you use the code CULT in the checkout at crimecon.co.uk. And you could submit your story to the Ally Awards at cultvaultpodcast.com and be in with a chance of winning a $50 Amazon voucher before the end of March, as well as a chance to win a copy of Mary Mahoney's Abnormal Normal, My Life in the Children of God by following, liking and commenting on my social media content across February on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. Now that all of that business is done, here is Evvie talking about their experience in the Church of Christ. Hello Evvie, and thank you so much for joining me on the show today. We're going to be exploring a new topic on the podcast and I'm really looking forward to learning more. So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yes, my name is Evvie and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. And I am a Black, queer, disabled, neurodivergent artist and facilitator and activist and survivor.
Wow, that is quite something. If you were to write that on a business card, I think people wouldn't really know which element to start with. It all sounds really compelling, lots of different things. So when you mean activist, what types of activism are you involved in?
Yeah, I feel like that is dynamic for me. A lot of it has to do with what is happening in my own life and in the lives of people that are in my community, and about what's happening in the world in the present moment and what's needed. So right now, what feels very alive for me is like cult survivor, and particularly like people of color who are survivors of cults, and really bringing their voices out and me speaking up as well. And then in other parts of my life, disability and LGBTQIA, like accessibility when it comes to communal spaces and making sure that there's places that folks feel belonging when they have a marginalized identity, like one of those.
That is absolutely incredible. What a fantastic contribution you must be to those spaces and those often marginalized community groups. So I'm so looking forward to hearing how you found yourself where you are and working so hard for the rights of all of these different people, to make sure that they feel seen and heard. I feel like we're going to go on quite a journey with today's story. So let's get into the main bulk of things. What is the name of the movement that we are going to discuss today?
So the group is called the Church of Christ, and specifically the non-institutional Church of Christ. They don't call themselves non-institutional. That's what the mainline Church of Christ calls them. And there are many different branches of the Church of Christ, or COC. I probably will end up using that because it's easier, as some of us call it. And I was raised in the southeastern branch of the non-institutional Church of Christ. And even though, I guess I also just want to say, like even within the non-institutional Church of Christ, there are branches. So there's there's the One Cup groups, and I was part of the main group of the non-institutional Church of Christ. And some of the features are that they are all autonomous congregations. They don't claim any affiliation with the mainline Church of Christ or the World Convention denomination. They are extremely fundamentalist, I would say like nationalist as well, and very conservative. And the thing that other people like outside the group recognize about them and as a defining characteristic is that they forbid any instruments to be used in the worship service. So there's no instruments and there's no instrument like sound. So no clapping, humming, like emotion.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So like silence other than the person leading the service.
Yeah, so there is a cappella singing that is a part of the worship service, but there's no instruments or other accompaniments that are not just a cappella singing.
That is really difficult to imagine if it's not something you've seen or experienced, especially in comparison to some of the things that we've talked about on the show before around Pentecostalism, with being drunk on the Holy Spirit and casting demons and all of these very loud events and experiences that come with a lot of overstimulating. So I imagine if we were to go and watch videos or attend services of the Church of Christ, it would be very different to other things that we've discussed on the show, which is interesting in itself. And also what's interesting is that you said that the mainline Church of Christ has labeled the church that you were a part of as the non-institutional Church of Christ. So is that because the Church of Christ wants to distance itself from the non-institutional Church of Christ's beliefs and practices? Is there some kind of tension between the two groups? And I suppose it's worth looking at where the Church of Christ came from and how this first branch that then split off into other branches came to be also.
Yes, I would be happy to share about the history and how it came to be. And I would say that the mainline, so growing up in the non-institutional Church of Christ, I didn't know that there was a mainline Church of Christ because they're so separate. And so like they don't acknowledge the mainline churches of Christ at all. And so I would say that the tension and the kind of distancing is coming from the non-institutional Church of Christ, as far as them saying like, we're not a part of that larger group, and casting doubt and suspicion and basically saying that those people are not part of the one true church, but just the non-institutional group are the one true church. So to give some context and history, the Church of Christ was started by Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone as part of the Restoration movement in the United States in the early 1800s in Tennessee. And it came to be called the Stone-Campbell movement churches. So Stone and Campbell felt that instead of some of the mainline denominations, various doctrines and like trappings and elaborate rituals and like really elaborate church buildings, that all Christians should worship together in a simple way, and they should only call themselves Christians or disciples of Christ. So that's like versus Presbyterian or Methodist or Anglican or, what some of the other churches were called. And I actually didn't grow up knowing any of this. I only found out about most of it shortly before I left the Church of Christ, because I did some of my own research, and the official non-institutional Church of Christ doctrine is that the Church of Christ is the non-institutional Church of Christ, which they just call themselves the Church of Christ. I want to make that clear, but they teach that they are the one and only church that was started by the 12 apostles and Jesus on the day of Pentecost in like the first century, and that it has continued uninterrupted from the day of Pentecost in Acts, I think, in the New Testament, through the present day. So they completely dismiss and obscure the origins of the movement. And I think if someone were to try to teach like that the Church of Christ was started by Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, that it would be considered false teaching or apostasy in ICOC.
Surely there are other religious movements out there that claim to also be the one true movement that started on the same day. So do they have any sort of evidence or do they have any scripture that they use to back up this claim? Or do they just, does the congregation just sort of take the leadership at their word?
Yeah. So another part, like one of, I say some other groups call the Church of Christ, maybe not so lovingly as Bible thumpers, because they have a really big emphasis on book, chapter, and verse and backing everything up with scripture. And so the primary scripture that they use, I think, is Acts 2:38. I've been out of the movement for like 10 years, so that might not be the exact one, but I'm pretty sure it is, because I heard it so many times. And that basically was like the scripture that it talks about like the Holy Spirit being given to the apostles and the church being established at that time after the death of Jesus. And then as far as other groups, they basically just say like, because during that time in the scripture, I think in Acts 2, the disciples called themselves just disciples of Christ, that is why they call themselves disciples of Christ or just Christians and without any other names, and that those other names and other sects are aberrations on the original one true church.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the scripture being used in that way, because that is not unique to some of the other stories that have come through on this show. But of course, if that is all that you have lived and all that you have experienced, you have no other reference point to realize that there are thousands of other branches of Christianity that also claim to be the one true faith, that also claim that every other faith is a cult, or an aberration, as you said, or just simply, being led by the devil, or whichever explanation the church might use to explain why these other faiths are wrong and why you are a part of the only true faith. And that must be difficult to grow up in an environment where you are taught these things, to then realize at some point that there is nothing particularly unique or special about that proclamation, because there are millions of people around the world who are being told the same thing. I don't know if that's something you experienced as you decided to distance yourself from the church.
No, I mean, I guess my path out, I call it a slow fade, because my separation from the Church of Christ really had to do with the doctrine initially, and I didn't leave Christianity altogether. And then there were some things that I have left Christianity altogether now, but at the time when I first left, I didn't for several years. And then there are some things that were teachings in the Church of Christ that I never fully believed, or that I kind of was like, I don't know if I completely agree with that, but I didn't necessarily say anything to other people. But I do remember growing up, like we weren't allowed to go to other churches. So we would invite, when I was a kid, I would invite my friends to like come to children's, like the vacation Bible school or things like that. And sometimes they would come with us, but then they might invite us to their vacation Bible school, and I could never go. And I always felt really like weird about that, and that it wasn't fair. And even as a child, I was like this doesn't make sense that we can invite people to our stuff, but we can't ever go to their things. And people would say that. And as a kid, I'd just be like, well, that's what the rules are. So
this particular branch of the Church of Christ, is this something that you were born into?
Yes, I was born and raised in the non-institutional Church of Christ. My parents were part of the group and married in the group about a year before I was born. So they were pretty new in the movement when I was born. And I'm the oldest of the children that my parents had together. After they were married, I have one older sibling and two younger siblings, and or three younger siblings actually, and one sibling passed away as an infant. And so my entire family of origin is in the movement and was in the movement throughout my life. And it also my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, is a part of the movement. And then since I've left, some of my aunts and uncles also have become a part of the group. And I kind of, it's hard to say exactly like when I left, because I was having doubts for a really long time. I would say probably at least like 6 years before I actually just stopped going, which was in 2009. But I became disillusioned because I was very pious as a teenager and as a young adult. And I took the Bible very seriously because we were taught to like read the Bible, to follow everything it said literally. And I got really disillusioned and discouraged because I felt like the teachings of the Bible and the way they were actually being applied in the group were either false or were wildly inconsistent. And I had been homeschooled and like completely isolated from mainstream society. But one of the teachings that really, I think, was the primary reason, like the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was that the teachings about taking care of the poor and people who don't have family, and really about serving the community. And I felt very strongly about that, and I still do. And so I didn't see that happening in the Church of Christ. It's very insular. And so if there is support given, it's only to people who are members. And I felt like that was wrong. And I had a really hard time for several years seeing the incongruity between like what was in the Bible and what Jesus was saying that Christians should be doing, and what was actually happening and what I was seeing.
That aligns so much with my own personal thoughts and feelings on sort of religion as a whole. When we have these conversations, and especially when you look at things like purity culture, and I often ask the question, and I know it's not as simple as this. I know it's not as, black and white as just saying that, if somebody can't afford to wear certain clothes and dress in a certain way, or doesn't have the education to present themselves or articulate themselves in a way that would make them seem, sort of as modest on the outside as they are on the inside, if personal circumstances do not allow that person to fit a particular church's vision of what a modest person should look like outwardly, how does that person then become any less closer to their chosen God just because they can't meet those requirements? And I know that that's only one small part of this entire conversation and this entire sort of subject as a whole, but it's always the one reference point that I come back to, because a person's personal circumstances, meaning that they can't meet certain man-made ideas of what a person should look like or how a person should conduct themselves, does that mean that they're any less holy? I'm not sure. Just because a person falls in love with somebody of the same sex, does that mean that they're any less holy? It's this big thing that we always come back to. But what you've said there about those doubts and those kind of those seeds that you had growing up that then manifested into something a bit more, all of the values and all of the lessons that we are taught through scripture and through biblical text that aren't then applied to us as a congregation, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. Our love for our community should not be conditional. You can only receive the love of the Lord, and you can only receive the help of this congregation and this community if you stay within these walls, if you remain a practicing member of this church. And that doesn't make sense. And what you said there about sort of not helping the wider community and not going out and helping the less fortunate and the marginalized and other community groups that I'm sure we'll discuss throughout this episode, that doesn't align with the overall sort of messages within the biblical text if you read it at face value. And I understand that scripture can be used and changed to kind of fit anybody's belief systems, and the rhetoric that comes with all of that is it's kind of like a minefield. But you summed it up perfectly in the way that you've just said that.
And I was, it's interesting. I'm a pretty idealistic person even today. And so as a young person, I guess I'm still young, but as a younger person, especially as a teenager and in my early 20s, I was so just taken with the like radicalness of like the character of Jesus, and like how he defended the poor and like defended people who were outcasts. And I didn't see that in the Church of Christ. So at first, when I left, I went looking for a group of people who were Christian who were doing those things, because I felt like it wasn't the religion itself, it was just that particular group. And so I kind of just moved my devotion into Christianity at large. I actually did go to a Church of Christ college when I first graduated from high school, when I left home, called Freed-Hardeman University in Tennessee. And I had a horrific experience there. And so I ended up transferring after 3 years to a like completely secular school in Florida, and graduating from that school. But it was really my time. Like I went to that school thinking this is going to be the utopia where everyone's like really following the Bible, and I'm with all my peers and we will all be like serving our community. And like that was not at all what I experienced. And so it really, I think that was the point where I was just like, these people are not following God. I don't know who they're following. It was incredibly racist, which I can go into later. And so that was the point where I just lost at least my attachment to the Church of Christ itself.
And what I know that we've briefly gone over some of the principles and practices of the church in the way that they don't allow instruments or kind of any other sounds other than a cappella singing, so no clapping or applause and things like that. But is there anything else that you remember specifically from attending certain services or church events that would give us more of an overview of your time during the Church of Christ when you were a member of it, as opposed to the kind of historical side of things that you went through briefly before?
Yes. So let's see. So the autonomous congregations being led by elders and deacons is I would say, part of the core teachings in the Church of Christ. And one thing I do want to say about the a cappella singing is there's only very few things that I miss. And actually the a cappella singing was often quite beautiful and
very ethereal, I imagine.
Yeah, and I actually got a really good music education being in the Church of Christ, because some of the congregations take singing very seriously, and they would even have classes where you would learn like how to read music and what part of music that you sing. I'm an alto, and so they took it very seriously. And I think now that I have left and I've gone, I've studied healing, just kind of like in the larger human society, I know that there's something really like beautiful somatically that happens when people sing together. And I did experience this feeling of like, collective like unity and blending voices with other people. And that was something that we would just do for fun in college, was get together and sing together. So sometimes I do miss that, even though the music is really triggering. And so it's like I miss the feeling of it, I guess, more than I miss the specific music. And that is, I like to name things that I miss, because I think sometimes it can be easy to just focus only on the things that were horrible, which were abundant. And I certainly don't want to downplay those things. And there are things that I miss too. The Church of Christ music has a very doomsday vibe. So a lot of it is singing about people losing their eternal souls, and they have their own very specific songbooks that only the Church of Christ uses. And women are not allowed to like sing or like lead singing. And so, I mean, you can only participate up to a point, but that is something that I actually enjoyed when I was a part of the group. I would say the two doctrines that the Church of Christ would teach to someone in order to convert them would be the 5 acts of worship and the 5-step plan of salvation. And those two doctrines are something that I haven't encountered in other in like my exploration of other Christian groups that seem pretty unique to the Church of Christ. And so the 5-step plan of salvation is that you have to hear the Bible, believe all of it, repent of any sins publicly, confess that you believe the entire Bible, the Church of Christ teachings, and Jesus as the Son of God, and then be fully immersed in water, or baptized. And they are very strict about this, that if you don't do each one of those things exactly and perfectly as they teach, your eternal soul will be tortured in a lake of fire for all eternity. And they're so legalistic about it that it's like I've seen people get baptized and then like maybe 10 years later, like even people in my family, be rebaptized at a certain point, because they're like, I don't know if my foot and my toe popped out, and maybe I wasn't fully submerged, or maybe I didn't perfectly believe all of the doctrines at the time that I was baptized. And so there is this feeling of like that your salvation can be lost at any time, and this feeling of needing to be perfect and to practice and believe everything perfectly, when it comes to the plan of salvation, the 5-step plan. And then for the acts of worship, that's another thing that they really lean on, as that sets them apart from other groups, and that it's the only correct and acceptable way to worship. And so in any Sunday worship service, there must be singing, praying, communion, teaching or preaching, and a collection of money. And they have scriptures that are used to back up each one of those things. I don't remember all of them anymore. And also that members of the Church of Christ are expected to attend every single service. And if you don't attend the service, that is a sin, and it's called forsaking the assembly. Even if you just miss it one time because you were like watching football or like were tired or something like that, it's just expected that you're there every time the doors are open. And then finally, I would say the last kind of core teaching that someone might be taught in order to be converted is that there's this belief that Jesus will come back at any time to reclaim his followers, and that the world will end in fire. And although they don't, so it's different than some other evangelical Christian churches because they don't believe in the rapture. Like they're very adamant that like there's no rapture, there's no tribulation. It's just like an instant Jesus comes back. There's the day of judgment, and the people who are in the Church of Christ and have lived faithful lives will be ushered into heaven. There aren't really specific teachings about heaven and what heaven is like, but hell is presented as like such a horrifying, terrifying, awful thing that like any heaven is better than that. And so that's kind of just the way that that's how it's approached. And I would say like one of the things that they heavily depend on to convert people is creating that existential dread and that fear of hell. And that's used pretty heavily to keep people in line within the congregation as well.
And that fear must be so easy to prey on because mortality is one of the only things that is definite in life. Nobody is immortal. Nobody can live forever. We will all die at some point. And because that is one of the only certainties in life, isn't that so easy to prey on? It's not like a maybe this will happen, maybe it won't happen. We all know that at some point we all will die. And don't we want the best for ourselves in the afterlife, or don't we want the best for ourselves if Jesus is to come back one day and those of us who have been devout followers will be allowed to continue on and in heavenly circumstances as well, and the rest of the people will end in the lake of fire? It's I feel like it's one of those things that because we will all meet our end one day, it's an easier thing to exploit that as you said, existential dread, because you know I lie in bed sometimes and I go into my existentialism, and I just think this is not a good thing to think about before bed, but you know, I think even those of us that haven't practiced in high demand religions or been involved in high demand religious groups still have those moments where we are lying in bed and we experience our own existential crisis, where we're thinking, you know, will it be tomorrow? Will it be 20 years? Will I accomplish everything I want to do? And that is without the pressures of an insular religious community that has scripture to reinforce the biblical messages that they have on top of that. So I can imagine that being taught those messages from a very young age, to have those images of hell ingrained in you from you know early ages into adulthood, must be quite a terrifying thing. And I can see why family members are so eager to be rebaptized.
Yes. I, as a child, I used to have nightmares and panic attacks about either dying in my sleep and going to hell, or Jesus coming back at any minute. I can remember they would say like the trumpet will sound and that will mark the end of the world. And so pretty much any loud noise would just like completely upset my nervous system. And like a train, an airplane, I lived in an area that was there are 5 military bases in the area, and so we would always hear the jet, so like a really loud jet, like, and there were so many triggers. And I did have this kind of terror about had I, been perfect during the day, and we were taught that you have sinned if you can understand the 5-step plan of salvation. And if you can understand it, then you are accountable. And if you have sinned, even if it's just disobeying your parents or getting annoyed at your, younger sibling, that's a sin. And so I was baptized at 9 years old because of that like feeling of terror. And honestly, at this point in my life, I feel like that should be considered child abuse, like teaching children those sorts of things, because it did cause me a lot of anxiety. And I've talked to other members who have left, and many of us have left years ago, and living with that sort of anxiety for years and years, and having been taught it from the time you could hear and talk and understand language, it kind of works its way into our bodies. And many of us do live with ongoing anxiety even after leaving, just because our bodies got into this habit of being anxious about dying, about other people dying and going to hell that we were in our families or that we cared about, or our friends. And it is really traumatizing, the doomsday element that, I was diagnosed with panic disorder in my early 20s. And it's interesting because when I received that diagnosis, it was there was a therapist that I saw who actually was a member of the Church of Christ. I saw this person a little bit later. I had seen someone else for just one session, and I think we'll probably talk about that later, but that put a bad taste in my mouth. And so I put off going to therapy for a while, but then I started having panic attacks again. And that therapist asked me to keep a journal of when I was having the panic attacks and like what was happening, so that I could figure out what the triggers were. And after a couple of weeks, when I came back and she looked at my journal, she made the connection that I was having them in only religious settings. So it would be, this is when I was in college. So like we had chapel that was mandatory every day. We of course had the 3 weekly services. There was devotional every night. We had mandatory Bible class. So there were so many opportunities for me to be in some sort of like religious setting. And a lot of times it was associated with the singing because the songs were so like doomsday focused. And that was a pretty substantial moment for me too, because I remember her saying that maybe I should take a break from going to the services. And I had never heard anyone suggest skipping services, but because my experience was so severe, I was having panic attacks multiple times per day, and it was really impacting my life. Like I wasn't able to go to class, and I was really not functioning and was very depressed. She suggested taking a break, and I was so frightened of losing my eternal soul that I didn't actually do that. But it's been a while. I don't really live with that anxiety anymore, but I definitely did for, I would say, the great majority of my life.
I don't feel like that's an uncommon experience for other people that have spoken on the show as well. Other guests that we've had, again, going back to Pentecostalism, in the early episodes where I spoke to David and Amanda, and they both said that even now when they hear loud noises, they still experience that initial panic that this is it, that they are about to be smited because they are watching Pirates of the Caribbean or something on the TV that has worldly things attached to it. And even, as they were growing, we've had people come on the show and say that they would have nightmares and they would have panic episodes around their father who didn't practice the faith and didn't join in with services and didn't go to church activities because he was an atheist and he was just kind of doing his own thing. And what you've said there about, keeping recruiting or converting members of the church is one thing, but retaining them through that fear for themselves or their loved ones is such a profound thing. And even the music in itself, where you're talking about the a cappella singing and the choir, it's like a juxtaposition. It's this beautiful sound that it is angelic. It sounds so like otherworldly, like and it's often used as a way to get people into a trance-like state, to allow people to lower their guard, to allow them to be more suggestible and susceptible to ideas. And then for the words in those songs to have such a juxtaposition meaning to the way that they sound, that is like mental gymnastics in itself. To hear such beautiful sounds, and those sounds are hellish messages, is really difficult for me to even comprehend. So to experience and live that must be another thing entirely. And as you said, it was actually a part of the church that you enjoyed, but then it went on to trigger you. So again, another difficult thing to really explore in your mind, to work out sort of how you journey through that, enjoying certain things, but then having them trigger you. I don't know if there's a solution you've come up with. You said that you went to some sessions and with just friends, and that was quite nice. And I don't know if there are other similar types of a cappella music that you can listen to that don't have those types of lyrics, or is there a way that you've found to kind of have that without it being upsetting?
Yeah, I feel like a few years ago, I was at a movement conference, like a workshop for activists, and I was able to reclaim this love of singing and music. My group did a presentation for the larger conference, and part of what we did was kind of split up our time and gave each person a portion. And the portion that I chose was a song. And so a couple of other people in our group had this song that was like an activist song. It was called Grief and Praise. And I chose to lead the song, which is something that would never have been allowed in the Church of Christ. But I was like, I'm going to do this. Let me learn this song. So we practiced together. And then I got to lead this song while everyone was singing. We were standing in a circle and we were singing the song, and it's a round, which are like my favorite kinds of songs. And it was during a ritual of like letting go that we were doing, that we created in our group for the larger group. And it was so beautiful. People were expressing emotions, we were, people were supporting each other, and I was singing, and I can't imagine, it was one of the happiest moments of my life, because I felt like I got to reclaim that love of singing and to do it in a completely different context with activists who are working to make the world a better place. It was an emergent strategy workshop, and it was just really, it was wonderful. And so I would say at this point in time, I don't have that like negative connection with the singing. And during that weekend, I actually spent some time intentionally grieving, because that was part of, like, the song was called Grief and Praise. And I actually listened to some of the music from the Church of Christ, because you can find it on YouTube, the a cappella singing. And I just bawled and cried. And I was just like, it was so hard, for this to be something that was a part of my life that I both loved and hated at the same time, that I was like both triggered by and also enjoyed. And I wanted to be able to move out of that grief and into something else. And I feel like I was able to do that weekend. So I'm really grateful for that experience. And I now, as a facilitator, always incorporate singing into my facilitation. And so I normally have a song. It might be Grief and Praise. There is a couple of other songs, and I encourage participants, especially when we were meeting in person, to sing together. And it's been really magical to create those moments in my own facilitation spaces where we're talking about activism, and to have it be something that's life-giving instead of triggering.
That is so incredible. That is, in so many different ways, that is amazing, because not only are you empowering yourself as a leader of this workshop, you are allowing yourself to experience an art form that meant so much to you and moved you in so many different ways. And you've allowed yourself to experience it whilst giving others the opportunity to experience and empower themselves to then go on to empower other people. That is like layers of greatness. And the fact that you mentioned having a moment to really look inside yourself and grieve something that you had in your life that you no longer have is also so incredibly important to highlight and mention, because a lot of the time when people speak about leaving these high demand groups, there is often this level of grief that hasn't been identified yet. And people say, oh, I didn't realize that I didn't have the childhood that I should have had, that was taken from me because of a captive organization. And so now I am grieving the childhood that I never had. Or not being able to experience a typical education if people have been homeschooled, and understanding that they are grieving the experiences that they will never have. And even for you to acknowledge and recognize that there is something in you that is lost, and it hurts to lose it, even though it was hurting you at the time, is it's almost cognitive dissonance, but also something that you were able to work through. And I feel like that is so interesting to think about, and it's got to be empowering for other people listening who may have their own art forms that they enjoy. And I always say that creativity is so important, and people who have had writing or singing or playing instruments or any of these creative outlets taken away from them or abused or exploited in some way, who have been able to get some of that back and let themselves vulnerable to these experiences again, to understand that these art forms can be so healing and helpful and beneficial for us. That's so commendable. And I think you are all so brave for allowing yourselves to have those open experiences with things that can help us to heal and to grow. So that's so fantastic, and hopefully can be an inspiring message to anybody else who is listening, who may love writing or love even things like makeup and drawing and any of those different types of art forms, to just embrace those things, or if you feel that you are able to at some point, and know that you can have a healthy relationship with those things, I think is fantastic. But something else that you mentioned before around sort of the re-baptizing and this a constant anxiety around trying to remain pure and trying to remain holy, and trying to ensure that you never break any of those 5 steps or rules. That's such an impossible thing to achieve. And I feel like it is purposefully unattainable, because then followers of the faith are living their lives constantly striving for something that they will never reach. If people were to reach it, they may not stay. So of course it is set up in that way to ensure that people don't stray, don't wander. And that in itself, to be in that constant fight or flight mode, and to not really know if you're doing the right things, or if the end of days was to come all of a sudden, whether you would have done enough, That must be absolutely exhausting. I cannot imagine living in that type of environment.
Yeah, it definitely was exhausting. And one of the things that has been incredibly helpful for me in the last couple of years is I encountered somatics and somatic therapy, and particularly like in groups. And then I'm actually in training right now to become a facilitator, a somatic practitioner facilitator. And what I learned through like studying somatics is that singing in a group is a somatic practice. It actually does release like energy and trauma from our bodies, and it does help our nervous systems and other people's nervous systems calm. And to and I didn't want to, as particularly as a Black person who's descended from enslaved people, singing is a huge part of our culture, and that was like something that enslaved people would do to like soothe and comfort themselves as they're in this horrific, traumatizing, brutal situation. And I feel really strongly and felt really strongly that those types of somatic practices that can help our bodies heal, that I want to reclaim them, and I don't want those things to be lost just because of someone, in a group like this abusing it in order to cause harm. And that is something that feels like a very active part of my life even now. But I am able to practice it without all of the like legalistic rules and parameters that the group put on it. And to see it actually, like, in some ways, me be able to reclaim my culture that in many ways was erased from being in this group, because in the Church of Christ, the singing had to be emotionless. It was stoic. There was no singing, there was no humming, there was no swaying, no stomping, clapping. And those are all things that Black folks would do, particularly like in Black churches. And all of that is somatic practice. And so now I approach it from a somatic perspective as opposed to like a religious kind of ritual, thinking like this is actually like singing with other people, encouraging us to sway together and to hum together. And I've even, done that in some of my support groups to close, that will just like all hum a note for 30 seconds to kind of sync our nervous systems up and calm and ground before we leave. That those sorts of things are really powerful, and they don't have to be the realm of like these destructive groups, that they can be something that we reclaim. And it's also not wrong not to reclaim them if they're too triggering. It took me years to get to a point where I could lead a song, and probably was like 8 years out. So there's not a specific timeline or right or wrong way to do it. I just happen to feel particularly strongly about that as a part of my journey towards like discovering who I am and reconnecting with my culture.
And you mentioned briefly that you were homeschooled in your upbringing. Was that for all of your education until you went on to college, or kind of was it a brief arrangement? And what did homeschooling look like? Was that common for Church of Christ members?
So it depends. So originally I went to school at first, through elementary school. These were in the early years before my parents were as indoctrinated. So when I was in elementary school, they hadn't been in the Church of Christ for a decade yet. But when I was 11 years old, my parents attended a hyper conservative non-institutional Church of Christ conference in another state. And at that conference, they were coerced and coached by some more extreme members of the group to take me and my younger siblings out of public school under a religious exemption. And that also happened the year that my parents had kicked my older sibling out of the house in his senior year of high school for becoming too worldly, quote unquote. And what happened was that he had just gotten an earring, which is like a super normal thing in the mid 90s for like a young Black kid in the US to do. But in that group, everything was so extreme. Any kind of, independent thought, any kind of like breaking of the rules was just like, it's very black and white thinking. And so that was the result. And so I think their homeschooling us in some ways was meant to prevent us from like going towards the world. And there's another layer to this that feels complicated for me because I am neurodivergent. I had been diagnosed with ADHD when I was, I think, in second or third grade. And my parents, I remember growing up, especially in my early life when they seemed very invested in our education, that they were concerned that I would be labeled and like wouldn't get treated fairly in school. And I had been rejected from a gifted program, even though I met all the criteria, just for reasons that were obviously racist. And so on the one hand, I think there was a part of them that was thinking like they're going to be protecting us from like the racist school system. But what ended up happening is the longer that they were in the group, the less the less they cared about our actual education. And so it stopped being about our education and more became about isolating us from the world. And so I experienced educational neglect from the time I was in seventh grade until I graduated from high school. We weren't supervised, and there was no teaching that happened for me. And the non-institutional Church of Christ is pretty fundamentalist. They're nationalist. They're biblically literalist and staunchly anti-science. And so they have a whole publishing company called Apologetics Press, where the goal of that organization is to aid parents in indoctrinating children against legitimate science that's taught in schools. So we were taught things like evolution is a lie, that the world is literally created by God in 6 days, that the earth is 6,000 years old, which is otherwise known as young earth creationism, that Noah's flood literally happened exactly as it was written in the Torah, and that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time on earth. So I feel like it's layered. There was like an element of like wanting to protect us, wanting to isolate us, and then also wanting to like indoctrinate us into anti-science and nationalist rhetoric that wouldn't have really flown in the schools. And I also know that there were, myself included, but they were very against sex education. And so that was something that we might encounter in schools. And I know that my parents, even when I went to school, when we had sex ed, they would like write a letter to the school and make sure that I didn't attend. And I know other people in the Church of Christ did that too. So there was a group of, I would say, like extreme people in the non-institutional Church of Christ who homeschooled. It wasn't uncommon. I wouldn't say most children in the Church of Christ were homeschooled during the time that I was growing up in the church, but it did become more popular over, like when we first started homeschooling, there weren't very many homeschoolers. And by the time I graduated from high school, there were lots more people who were homeschooling. And that's complicated because like the school system in the United States isn't great in a lot of states. And so there are some people, even religious people, who homeschool because they're actually concerned about the quality of education that their children are getting. And that can very easily get mixed up with people like my family who were like, you should just study the Bible. That's the most important thing for you to study. So it's not important for you to learn algebra. It's not important for you to learn, science. And because of the immense amount of educational neglect that I experienced, especially I think some of it was like misogyny, because as a kid who was assigned female at birth, my only role in the Church of Christ would have been to get married and be a homemaker and have children. And a lot of people felt like education for girls wasn't important, and that you need it made more sense to spend time teaching you how to cook or do things that were like homemaking skills or learning to sew, which, not to say those aren't valuable skills to have, and not in, the society in which we live, where you can't support yourself without an education. So it does serve to put women in a position where they have to rely on getting married and having someone financially support them. And I feel like I was on that path because of the educational neglect that I experienced. I was the first, like the oldest, to be homeschooled. And because of my experience, I advocated very strongly for my siblings to get more access to like outside resources, to be able to go to homeschooling co-ops, to be able to get like I taught my sister to play the piano. I actually also taught one of my sisters to read. Because we were, no one was supervising us. She got to be like 8 or 9 years old and she wasn't reading. And my parents didn't seem concerned about that, but I did. And I also knew that I was, getting to be upper in high school and that I was hoping to leave eventually. And so I taught her phonics, because we had this program to teach phonics. And then I convinced her to read by reading to her while she would wash the dishes, read a chapter book to her. And then I would get to the point where it was like, really good, and you want to know what comes next. And I would tell her like, well, if you want to know what happens, you have to read the rest of it yourself.
That is such a clever way of working around somebody who's not interested in doing something. That's a really, really good way of, I'm going to pinch that one, I think, for myself.
Yeah, it was very effective. And she became a very voracious reader. And I also, I think part of the reason that I ended up even learning anything during those years was because I am so naturally curious. And I was also so bored that I just would read anything that I could get my hands on. And so I did read textbooks. I remember reading the encyclopedia. This is in the time before like smartphones and the internet being widely available. So I really only had access to things at the public library and what was in our house. And I remember one way that my parents, I wasn't always I am pretty willful, which is probably why I left. I wasn't always responsive to, being sent to my room or even having certain privileges taken away. But one punishment that my parents would use was to tell me that I couldn't go to the library because I loved reading. And so it was really upsetting to me not to be able to go to the library, because I would go to the library and check out 5 or 6 books, the maximum amount of books, and be reading all of them at the same time and read through all of them in just a few days, because I would just be reading all day long. And another thing I did was write in journals pretty much every day. And so I did eventually like learn things like history, and social studies and some of the life sciences just because I was interested in them. But things like math and the, more complex sciences like physics and chemistry that require algebra, I didn't learn those growing up in my education from 6th to 12th grade because no one was supervising me. And because I struggled with them, I was expected to just teach them to myself. And often we would be left alone all day. And I was the one who was responsible for my siblings. And so we would be given chores or, other things to do that weren't our schoolwork. And I just didn't have the resources available to teach myself algebra. There was no one to ask questions or anything like that. And so that has impacted me into adulthood. It affected what I decided to study in college because I didn't feel confident enough to study what I really wanted to study because I didn't feel strong in math. And I still feel some resentment about that because I think I would have chosen a completely different career path had I gone to school and had the support that I needed to study math and science, and also some of the extracurriculars that like playing sports and being able to, do art and theater and those sorts of things, which my siblings eventually got to do because I advocated for them to have access to those things, but I didn't get to have that growing up.
Just even things like building on your social skills so that when you do go into employment when you're older, you have the ability to interact with people that are not from the church or the congregation. And I understand that in some insular communities there would be no need for people to interact with people outside of that community. But if you are going to go into employment outside of that community, basic communication skills with people outside of the church are so necessary for comfortability in employment, for moving upwards in your chosen career path. So even that in itself is difficult to navigate. And what you've said about your neurodivergent diagnosis of ADHD, that must have been heavily impacted by the lack of structure around not having traditional education, and also not having perhaps even if you were being supervised, I don't even know if there would have been a person in that environment who would have understood necessarily what was required for you to actually learn productively, because everybody learns differently. And in mainstream education, there is not the capacity to facilitate each child independently and individually. But those who do end up with certain diagnosis of learning difficulties may have a better chance of finding support if there are trained staff on site who have worked with a number of people that have a diagnosis like ADHD. And even on top of that, what is problematic further is that if you were to continue on the path that was laid out for you, the path that many people have followed in groups like the Church of Christ, to become a homemaker, to not pursue further education, to get married young and start a family, and then homeschool those children, who then homeschool their children, who then homeschool their children. There is just a loss of information outside of that church. So there's no reference to how the world might not have been created in 6 days, and how the earth is probably older than the church tells us it is. There's no reference for that, because all that has been taught is being passed down, and there's nothing else to learn about, because there is nothing else known between the different generations.
Yeah. And then for a child like me who is just insatiably curious, and I don't think it's like conceited to say like pretty intelligent, I just was so bored, and it was painful to not have access to information, to not be able to explore. I'm a kinesthetic learner, so I learn from being in a dynamic environment, from movement. And reading a book about algebra isn't going to help me learn it. And one thing that I learned actually in college, once I left, like even the Church of Christ college, because I had to take a physics course to graduate, and I was really struggling. It was so challenging. And I remember I kept failing the exams, and I was studying so hard, and I just felt so defeated. Like, this experience of not having the education that I should have gotten growing up would basically prevent me from being able to be successful in life. And I don't think that there was ever really any acknowledgement in my family of how much I struggled. And I mean, when I was in school, I did have an IEP, the individualized education plan. I did have the like specialized support for ADHD. And so it is evident, really, to me, looking over the course of my entire education, that my parents got more and more indoctrinated, and that they really completely changed their mindsets on education over the course of my K through 12, that they were so invested in getting us into good schools and making sure that I didn't get labeled, and making sure I had the support that I needed when I was in school. And then over the course of the second half of my education, they completely just abandoned any concern about the quality of education that I was getting. And I mean, they didn't help me apply to college. What ended up happening was, when I got to be a junior in high school, I realized that in order to leave my family, I had to go to college. Like, that was my only way out. And that college was going, especially as a Black femme, in the US, where I would be facing all sorts of discrimination, which I was aware of that. You can't make a life and support yourself without any education, as someone who's like me. Mm-hmm. And my parents certainly would have known that. And so, and my dad went to college. He has a degree. And so, I just had to find it within myself to create my own structure and to find things to support myself. I found, this Shakespeare class, because I basically created a curriculum for myself of like what I felt like I would need to know to be able to get a good score on the SAT, and put those things in place for myself, and advocated for myself to my parents to let me go to the Shakespeare class for the last 2 years of high school, and to read classic literature so that I could increase my vocabulary, because I knew that was something that would be important for getting a good score. I kind of just had to let go of the math thing, because there was no way for me to learn it. But I thought, like, if I get a good enough score on the like writing and reading and verbal part of the test, then maybe it'll make up for the fact that my math score isn't that good. But those were the sorts of like reasonings that I was having to do for myself without any support at all from adults or any guidance, because I knew that was my only way to be able to leave my family, and that otherwise I was just going to be stuck. And I also had some inclination that I was not straight, and that I was questioning my gender. And so marrying a man and having children was not going to be an option that I thought I was like, that's probably not going to work for me. I'm pretty sure I would hate that. And because I had spent, I was so parentified as a child, I didn't really want children. And so I just, the life that was laid out for me is like, this is the way you're going to go. And then the life that I knew would actually make me happy, I knew I would have to pursue that myself. And the only way I saw to do that was to go to college. And so after years of not really getting any sort of like formal structured education, I did take it upon myself to create that for myself and did the best that I could, which I feel proud of that. And I also advocated for my siblings to have access to more resources, to be able to have more socialization and to participate in extracurriculars, because once I got to college, I could see how I was at a disadvantage because I hadn't had all of those things, and I didn't want that to be the experience for my siblings that were younger, because I wanted them to have choices to be able to support themselves.
You said there that you're proud of yourself, and I think that's probably that should be an understatement. You should be that. What is a word that's more than proud? Because what you said there is so deeply inspiring, that you were able to do all of those things for yourself. And it reminded me, one time I asked somebody for a piece of advice on what they would tell other Jehovah's Witnesses if they were going to leave the faith and pursue a life outside of the Jehovah's Witness organization. And they said, before you leave, you must have all of your ducks in a row. And that has stuck with me after all of these episodes, because that is so true. You were in such an insular community with a life laid out for you that would mean no further education, that would mean limited life skills, that would mean focusing on things like homemaking, cooking, cleaning, sewing, knitting, and all of those things, without knowing how to change the oil in your car, or how to change the tire, or even learn how to drive, and things that, things that maybe people like myself take for granted on a daily basis, things that we have access to that you may not have had access to if you were to stay on that course. And then to realize that you wouldn't be able to then go a step further than that and support yourself financially if you didn't have a further education, and then take the steps needed to make sure that you would meet the requirements to pursue that further education. That is such an incredible thing that you have done there for yourself and for your siblings as well. And I just think that being proud of yourself is one thing, but there should be a word that's like more than proud. that is so, like, that's really moved me there, what you've said. And I really hope that can inspire other people to know that they can make change for themselves as well. That no matter how trapped somebody may feel, then there may just be a way to look at how you can change things for yourself. What you said about, trying to expand your vocabulary, somebody may be experiencing the same things with not understanding how something like public transport works. If they're going to go and attend further education, or even attend, high school, how do I get there? I live in a really rural community, isolated from everything. The nearest town, the nearest high school is 30 miles away, and I have to walk 2 miles to get the bus. I don't know how buses work. Just that's just like an example plucked out of the air. But even that, is something that a person might be struggling with. And what you said there, it makes what seems impossible almost seem attainable. And I think that's great. And one thing I wanted to ask, when you mentioned earlier on about how the Church of Christ is quite nationalist and quite conservative in some ways, when your parents were trying to or thought that they were trying to protect you from things like racism in the part of America that you lived in, was your congregation then primarily Black people or people of color? And did them keeping you away from the worldly community and keeping you in an insular environment actually stop you from experiencing or learning about your culture and your heritage and your own history and those things that mean so much to you? And I think epistemology is the word, learning who we are, where we have come from, and what makes us who we are today. Do you feel like that was hindered or bolstered?
I definitely would say overall it was hindered. So that that is, I'll share a little bit of context. So the Church of Christ in the United States is not unique in the sense that the churches in most of the country are very segregated, and it there are, like, in most, I would say particularly in the Deep South, there's like Black churches, white churches, and maybe like Latinx or Hispanic churches. And that is pretty normal. However, in the area that I grew up in the Mid-Atlantic, it was different because the churches in the area that I grew up integrated in the 80s. And so they were mixed between, like, I would say they're pretty much like 50-50, if not like maybe 10% one way or the other, like Black and white, with a small group of other people of color, mostly immigrants. And there was a lot of movement between congregations because there was military in the area. And so for some reason, the military and groups like this just go together like peanut butter and jelly. And so there are a lot of military in the congregations that I grew up attending. And that was the way that I grew up. And I didn't know until I was in college. And I went to college in West Tennessee in a small town at a college called Freed-Hardeman University. I didn't know that the Church of Christ was so segregated until I went to college. And so that was a shock to me when I was an adult. I was not prepared for that at all. And that definitely was a traumatic, like, revelation for me. Growing up in the churches that we were in the Mid-Atlantic region, when the churches integrated, what happened was that the white churches just absorbed the Black churches, and then the culture of the church was what the white church was used to. And so all of the the historical, like, Black culture around music and oral history and all of that stuff just got completely erased. And it actually was taught to us as those things that Black churches do are unscriptural. They have this phrase in the Church of Christ about the worship service that they say it needs to be decently and in order. And what I was taught was that things like humming and swaying and clapping and singing with emotion, things like Negro spirituals, which were obviously not included in the songbooks for the white churches, that those things are not decently and in order, and that they're unscriptural, that they're sin, and that we shouldn't do them. And so what my experience was when I did eventually encounter Black churches was that I would be sitting there amongst my own people having a panic attack because they're singing, clapping and saying amen and like doing all of the things that like a normal Black church would do in the Southern US. And I'm sitting there thinking I'm going to go to hell for being there because it's against the rules that I was taught growing up. So that kind of whitewashing was the standard in the churches that I grew up in, even though they were racially mixed in a way that wasn't the case in most other churches of Christ in the United States. But I think now, I've spent the last 10 years undoing all of that stuff, learning that it's internalized racism that I was taught. And I've had to do a lot of work to get those kind of thoughts and impulses out of my mind because I was just taught them so repeatedly. And the other thing that is really sad is that I do feel this kind of alienation from like Black church culture. Like, that wasn't my experience growing up. And so that's not something that I can relate to other Black adults who grew up in, in a more culturally appropriate setting, I'll say. And when I went to Freed Hardeman in Tennessee, I was not prepared for the amount of overt racism that I experienced. It, even now, like, I get this visceral feeling of like, so to give an example, I, when it was probably within the first couple of months that I went to school during my freshman year, I went to this church that was near the campus with this Church of Christ that was near the campus with a group of maybe like 10 or 15 friends. And all of the friends were white. There was probably 25 students out of 1,600 at the college that were Black. So there weren't very many of us. And I didn't know about the Black churches because in like when the school would tell us about what churches were available, they didn't really include the Black churches as options. So I ended up going to this church. I think we were a little bit late. And I remember walking into the doors in the auditorium and looking and noticing that 100% of the people were white. And this is like, keep in mind, this is like in the Deep South, in a small town. I didn't grow up in the Deep South. I grew up in like a metro area. So this isn't something that I was used to. And I remember looking and feeling the like disdain, like the looks of like hate, stares of hatred, essentially, of disdain, disgust, of like, what are you doing here? And I could feel it in my body. And in Southern churches, there is a culture of like being super friendly, of like, if you're a visitor, after the service is over, people would swarm you, like hug you, thank you for coming, all of that stuff. So at the end of this service at this church, members are coming over to all my friends around me. They all ignored me. Oh. No one spoke to me at all. Yeah, it was, I mean, there's so many things that, I mean, I have so many stories, but this story particularly is one that feels like burned into my mind, because this was a Church of Christ. And at this point, I was still like fully in, I was still like believing that this is the one true church. And I was not prepared for an experience like that. And it was so traumatizing that I ended up throwing up from anxiety on the car ride home, because it felt like people just like dumped all of their hatred like onto me. The only person who did end up speaking to me right as I was leaving was the preacher, who had been a missionary in Africa for a significant portion of his life. And he kind of like sort of apologized, like didn't directly apologize, but it was so obvious what was happening and how the members were just completely disregarding me, ignoring me, hugging all my friends on either side of me, but just like didn't acknowledge that I even existed. That I think he felt guilty witnessing it and said, I don't remember if he said sorry, but he said something that was kind of like, this is how people are, and of course, I never went back. And I think even for my friends, it was kind of a shock, because they had never brought a Black person to that church before. And so they didn't know that that's what was going to happen. But I remember sharing that with my parents and just them kind of just dismissing it and not even validating.
So frustrating. That's so frustrating, because if you would have gone to a typical college, not affiliated with a religion or faith, and had a similar experience to that outside of the Church of Christ, would that have been thrown back at you? Like, we told you this would happen.
No, my parents didn't prepare me at all. I have no idea why they let me even go to that school. My parents grew up during Jim Crow, and they were teenagers during the civil rights movement. And so I know they know what this country is like. And truth be told, that town felt like stepping back into the 1960s. This was the early 2000s, but, I had experienced bias and racism before in more like covert ways, like in the church that I grew up in, where they were just like, Black culture is sinful, you know, or like they wouldn't say Black culture, but they would like name things that were Black culture, but like never that level of just like like overt racism. I even, you know, in the town around the school experienced being denied service at restaurants that were like walking distant from the campus. Yeah, it was horrible. So I had a horrific, traumatizing experience. And that, I think, more than anything was, you know, I mentioned the things about the doctrine, people not following the doctrine, but when I left the Church of Christ officially and stopped going, it was after being at that school and realizing like I'm not actually welcome in most churches of Christ. And the churches of Christ where I grew up, where people are all worshiping together, is not normal. That's not what happens in 99% of the churches. And so the experience I actually had in Tennessee was the normal experience that I would have as a Black person attending churches that were not exclusively Black churches.
It's despicable on so many levels, because not only have your parents pulled you out of mainstream education to protect you from things like racism, whilst maybe not realizing that the entire time you're still being subjected to a level of racism by having your entire culture dismissed, then you're going over to Tennessee where you're not told about the segregation, and it's not something you've ever experienced or thought to say, well, where do the people of color, what services do they attend? Because you don't even realize that that's a thing. And there's no churches listed that you know, where Black people only go to. So you're then kind of, why would you even think to ask, well, where should I go to practice? Where should I go to worship? That doesn't even cross your mind.
It never occurred to me. I just went wherever my friends went. And I'll share one more story. This is actually about the school. While I was there, I've heard that this has changed since I left, but while I was there, this would have been in the early 2000s, they did not celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which in the United States is a federal holiday where all public offices, banks, post office, everything is closed and schools are closed. And so I remember being in school there, and they just treated it like almost like any other day. They would have like some sort of sanitized, abbreviated version of like the I Have a Dream speech, and ask like a Black male, one of maybe the 5 who went to the school, to like read part of that in chapel. And that was the only acknowledgement. We still had class. And I've never heard of a school not honoring a federal holiday. It was mind-blowing. And that had probably been going on for decades at that school. And when I asked about it to somebody who was a prominent member of the Church of Christ in Alabama, who had generationally gone to that school, so that person was my parents' age, but she had gone to that school. Her children went to the school. Her parents had gone to the school. She said to me that she didn't even know why there was a Martin Luther King Jr. Day holiday. This is a white woman from Alabama in the Church of Christ, that all she knows is that he cheated on his wife, and she doesn't know why we would celebrate someone like that.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
the thing about the entire situation is it almost comes back to what we were talking about at the start of the episode, where your closeness to God is it's almost conditional, and in this situation it's conditional on the color of your skin.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
How can a person choose what color skin they are born with? So where exactly. We're talking about, be as modest on the outside as you are on the inside, a person can't change their circumstances, a person can't change the color of their skin, a person can't change the gender or person that they are attracted to. So again, how can these people decide how holy we are based on those things? That exactly. Is ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense, and it goes against the core principles of the religious text, does it not?
Right. Well, I mean, according to the Church of Christ, God created everyone, and if God created everyone, then that means that God created everyone of all the races, of all the genders, of all, and I feel like it was abundantly clear, especially after I went to Fried Hardeman, that to be righteous was to be white. And so it wasn't, it's not even, I mean, at this point, I'm like, I shouldn't have needed to like want to change myself, but it really, I don't know, there's such an incongruence. For me, those sorts of things were things that made me have more questions and made me doubt, because I was like, well, this seems wrong. Like, I'm pretty sure I tend to be more of an independent thinker, and not to always, don't always just take what I'm told. I process it and question it. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that this is not like, I'm pretty sure that that racism is like evil. And I'm pretty sure that enslavement was evil. And I'm pretty sure that the discrimination and brutality that Black people and other people of color, and particularly Indigenous First Nations people, experienced in the United States was evil. And like, the Church of Christ doesn't have any official, even though it started in the 1800s in the United States, in the South, in Tennessee and Kentucky, they don't have any official teachings about enslavement being wrong, about racism or anything like that. And so my assumption is that the churches were always segregated from the very beginning, and that if there were enslaved people that were converted in the Church of Christ, that they were a part of their own congregations from the time that the Church of Christ started up until the present day. And I even remember asking some people, I don't know if it was like a faculty at the school or somebody, maybe peers, like, if the worldly people, like the United States government, which aren't even Christians, if they could say that discrimination is wrong and there could be an entire civil rights movement where they tell everyone you have to integrate because this is wrong for you to be separated, then how is the Church of Christ still segregated? And that's okay. Like, wouldn't we be like behind where aren't we supposed to be more righteous than these people who are worldly? And so those sorts of things made me have more questions, made me doubt. And I think the racism was one of the biggest leaps of like doubts that I had as far as like Church of Christ, and eventually it just Christianity in general, because those sorts of things are not unique to the Church of Christ. The Church of Christ is very that's pretty run of the mill as far as like evangelical Christianity goes. And so it even though they claim to be like the one true church, the similarity that they have to like every other Southern evangelical church tradition is so similar that in things like racism, that it makes it hard to tell the difference, to be honest.
And we haven't even touched on the misogyny that you wrote about in your emails to me, and the difference between how men and women are treated in the church itself. And I feel like that's such an important and prevalent thing to discuss. But because we've never had the option to discuss race at length in terms of some of these Southern American congregations, it's almost like it's less of a prevalent thing because the racism is so obvious and so toxic and like humiliating for you to go through that experience, but also the spiritual abuse as well that comes from being born into the church and then basically being told that you're born into this church, but you can't really ever be a full member of the faith because of the skin color that you're born with, even though we want you to read this Bible and take the messages from it that we don't actually believe in or align ourselves with. That's such a horrific thing to go through. And then, of course, growing up as a person who was assigned female at birth, going through all of those things that probably didn't make sense to you as an independent thinker and somebody who wants to have individualism, but also then your journey into realizing that perhaps you don't identify with your assigned gender, and then having all of those difficult conversations with yourself on top of all of the stuff that comes with the introverted and extroverted types of racism that you're exposed to.
Right. And one thing I do want to say, because I thank you for mentioning that you hadn't had an opportunity to like discuss race at length, because my experience has been after leaving, and even in the past like couple of years that I've been connected with cult survivor communities, is that there isn't really a discussion of the experience that survivors of color have within the cult survivor community either. And like discussions of like race in our like survivor spaces and the unique struggle that people experience as survivors of color who leave these groups into a world that is dangerous, that is hostile, and that will not have sympathy for you as an uneducated person of color, as somebody who doesn't have the social and emotional skills, as someone who's traumatized. And it is really, I feel so passionately about it because of my experience. Like I have experienced being homeless, for 2.5 years and relatively recently. And part of that is because I would go to work and experience racism. So I'm not in the church. This is just like out in the community, I would experience housing discrimination, and no one prepared me for this in the group. No one taught me about how to navigate that. And on top of that, because I've left this group and my entire family and social network, I have no social support system anymore. And so that is a factor in people experiencing severe depression and being suicidal and like, going back even because they get out and they're trying to like live their lives and it's too hard. And it turns out that some of the things that this group has told us about the world being evil and dangerous is actually true for people of color in a way that it's not true for survivors that aren't people of color. And so I'm actually going to be speaking about that and more like at greater length at the International Cultic Studies Association conference this year. I'm going to have a session on like race and the experience of survivors of color in the cultic community, because I am, I'm an activist in any, situation that I find myself in, any environment. And I'm always like, how do we make this better? How do we make it more inclusive? And how do we tend to and support and elevate and amplify the voices and experiences of people who are the most marginalized in any group. And I noticed, like, in a lot of the literature, and a lot of the documentaries that are done about cult survivors, there's very few Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And these are people who are targeted by these groups because they're already disenfranchised from the larger society. And I understand why my parents thought that it was a good idea to raise us in this group. Do I agree? Absolutely not. But I also have the benefit of retrospect of having grown up in this group, and my parents joined around when they were my age, and having lived in the civil rights movement and like witnessing what was happening in the United States in the previous like 3 decades. I can understand their thought process of thinking like raising us in this church where people are worshiping together, where they had actually a significant amount of support as parents, for all of the harm that they cause, which I do feel like the harm outweighed the benefits. But as people going in and having no experience, not having lived, in the group for as long as they have now, and not having the experience of being born and raised in the group, I could imagine why they would have thought it was a good idea. And I think that I just feel very strongly about like naming that and naming that I think cult survivors are in a unique position as people who know what it's like to be othered, as people who know what it's like to other, as people who have had to reconstruct and deconstruct our entire worldview, that we are in a unique position to even address things like racism among ourselves, because like even more than the general population, I think, because we have practice at doing the things that need to be done in order to change these sorts of things. And so it's just something I feel really strongly about. And it's something that I want to just name and lift up.
There sounds like there is definitely a gap and a need for more research and resources for cult survivors that are also people of color. From what you said there, it sounds like there's a big gap and a lot of information missing. And I think it's so fantastic that you are applying yourself to that, to provide that research and those resources for people. To speak at an ICSA conference is not a small thing. So, to have the courage to do that on top of everything that you've already told us that you've done is such a huge thing. And I have no doubts that we will see your name on the tops of research papers and maybe even books and just huge researched resources that will be a huge help for cult survivors and for people of color, and both communities combined. I think that's such a fantastic thing that you're working towards. And you mentioned that actually, interestingly, you've already been involved with the publication of a book. And I didn't know if you wanted to just mention that kind of little side story.
Yeah, that book, yesterday I was thinking about just like reflecting on this, and I realized that when that book was published, the book is called Girl to Girl, and I was involved in writing it when I was 16. And I think it was published when I was 18. It basically is a cookbook of like all of like purity culture and toxic like legalism, specifically toxic misogyny for adolescents who are assigned female in the group. And in retrospect, it's incredibly toxic, and I don't agree with any of it now. But to be honest, that book being published and these sorts of like other performances of piety were the only times that I experienced my parents expressing that they were proud of me. And so on some level, I felt push towards doing those things and to do things like speaking on ladies' conferences and that sort of thing, even though I didn't even necessarily like agree with all of it, because that was how I could get like attention and validation. And I think that is really unhealthy and probably was like a trauma experience that I like, even now I feel I'm just noticing that it's like my energy has dropped thinking about that. Because I, of course, like any child, I wanted my parents to be proud of me. And for me, it wasn't really academics or, even as an adult, like a job or any kind of outside acclaim that I could get. The only things that really would make them proud of me is me being seen as a performance or achieving things within the Church of Christ, because that group is so insular. And people do kind of become like Church of Christ famous, if you've written books and that sort of thing.
And that book is still available for purchase today.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
But it doesn't have your actual name. It's a pen name or a pseudonym that's attached to the book.
No, so that's when I came out as non-binary, I changed my name. And right. So that book is under like what was my legal name.
Right.
So I'm kind of glad about that. And also, it has like my picture and stuff on it. And it's interesting that book, one of the chapters, it wasn't the chapter that I wrote, but one of the chapters was based on a survey that were done of boys or guys, I guess, at Freed Hardeman, where asking them to name the articles of clothing or types of clothing that they felt were immodest or that would cause them to lust. And basically at that, even in the book, we're like indoctrinating other teens and young adults to submit to the male gaze and to let them tell us what we are allowed to wear. What ended up happening was that basically every article of clothing that anyone could possibly wear was named. And so it really showcased how there was no way to act. Like, it's totally normal to have sexual thoughts when you're looking at other people. Mm-hmm. And you're like, I probably at any age, but particularly as a teenager, like a young adult, but it pathologized it. And for me, that I did honestly feel creeped out. I'm surprised that more people didn't feel creeped out. I remember it being like, wow, we've gotten so enlightened by this information that they shared with us. But because of that type of environment, I had completely suppressed my suppressed. I'm not sure which one of those is the correct word, but push down any like desire. I lived and identified as asexual for the first 29 years of my life, because I knew that it was like those things are so demonized. Like purity culture was such a big part of growing up in the Church of Christ that it kind of felt like, I think on a subconscious level, that I should never ever experience attraction to anyone.
Yeah. Just in case you do anything wrong, it's best to just not do anything at all ever.
Yeah. And you can't just turn that off. I know other people who have even gotten married and had trouble, having really messed up views of sexuality and gender because of how we were taught to think about mm-hmm. those things. And that book contributed to that mm-hmm. for sure.
Well, I saw a post on Reddit the other day. I've mentioned this in a previous interview, but that it was a post on r/ex-Christian, and it said, does anybody else struggle with fetishes because of the purity culture that they grew up with? And the thread was both men and women. Well, I imagine it was all people. The thread was mm-hmm. all people discussing fetishes that they have grown. I don't know what the right word would be.
Yeah, developed
fetishes that they have developed around purity culture, which basically just meant that they became attracted to hair of a certain length or skirts of a certain length. So if the women could only wear skirts below the knee, that then became attractive and fetishized by some of the people in the church and the congregations that these Redditors were speaking from. So it, and when you mentioned the male gaze there, you know, women's mouths and lips are so over sexualized in TV, film, media, that then in everyday life, even when people are just having conversations with women who aren't wearing lipstick or doing anything to obviously overemphasize those features, does that then not just necessarily mean that women's mouths are then sexy anyway? So how do you can't just not have a mouth. So how do you get away from that side of the male gaze? It's I saw another thing yesterday, and I'm probably going to mess up the wording, but it was something like purity culture has taught us that women, like, no matter what we do, how we dress or anything, we are the problem because men are attracted to us.
Yes.
However, in any way. And of course, this is just looking at the very simplistic, a man and a woman marry and then they will have sex in their marital bed. We're not even talking about any of the LGBTQIA plus community, or how a person might not feel that they identify with their assigned gender from birth, how a person might be attracted to multiple people of multiple genders for different reasons. This is literally just talking about how men may still be attracted to women no matter how they look or dress or talk or act, because men are just attracted to things. Like that's right. That's human nature, isn't it? Like that is just so that's without even touching on the LGBTQIA plus community, which I feel is still an important thing to touch on. So what, and I suppose the answer to this at this point is probably obvious, but what are the views, thoughts and feelings around that particular community group in the Church of Christ?
Yeah, so I would just say in a simple way that it being anything other than cisgender, heterosexual is a one-way ticket to hell. Like, that's the most succinct way that I can put it. I have heard in sermons in the Church of Christ, people compare, first of all, they talk about homosexuality, using that word, all the time. Every sermon, every time. And it is compared to being a murderer, essentially. And like, because in some ways, I feel like they might even consider it to be worse, because it's a part of an identity, whereas murder is something that is an action that you could like confess and repent of. And I grew up hearing that every 3 times a week at least. And I mean, that's not even to, my family was heavily involved, and we were almost doing things with the church every day and traveling a lot around to these conferences where we would be listening to sermons all day long. And people would be talking about the sin of homosexuality, about the immorality of like gay marriage, and, any human rights being given to LGBTQ people constantly. It took me years, and I feel like at this point, I just am like, sexuality is fluid and dynamic. I am not even trying to like have a label, because I'm still getting to know myself. It's taken me years to be able to know what it is. Like at this point, I think I would loosely describe myself as like pansexual and my gender as non-binary, but I've gone under different labels at other times because it has taken years to even uncover who I am, because of all of the indoctrination and like coercion that I experienced. And growing up, I never really understood why there was such a fixation on gay people. And I never really agreed with it, actually. Even when I was in, I felt like I was still like very devout. I always kind of felt sorry for queer people and was like, why is the church picking on them? Like, that doesn't really seem right. And it doesn't make sense for people to be created in a certain way and then be told that something that they are is an abomination. Like that always felt contradictory to me. And so I know that there's been a lot of trauma from like of other like people who are queer or people who have gender, who are gender nonconforming or trans, who grew up and who particularly people who are born and raised in the church, because that is what you are being taught over and over and over again, even as you're trying to understand your own identity and desires.
And the whole thing around sex education and taking kids out of classes when they may be taught sex education, and the lack of and I've spoken about this in another episode, but the lack of sex education and relationship education means that at this age where you are kind of learning who you are and maybe trying to, not just kind of going with the flow and not trying to find what label fits, because maybe that's just an impossible thing to do. And I don't think that that's necessarily even a bad thing. It, like, you maybe don't even at this point, people might not even understand their own bodies and how things feel and how things work, because you're so taught not to, to explore those things or touch yourself or understand yourself, because then it's sinful, even if it's just like, yes, I don't know, check for lumps and things like that. So there must be so many people out there who are not only trying to navigate their orientation, sexual orientation, and what they feel comfortable with, but also just learning them, who they are and themselves and how their body works and how their body feels. And that must also be quite a significant journey to go on personally with yourself.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, this isn't unique to the Church of Christ either. This is something that is a problem in all of Southern evangelical Christianity. Very, very similar. I remember being given books that were, books like I Kissed Dating Goodbye, things that were about purity culture that other evangelical young people were reading in other churches. So there wasn't, as much as the Church of Christ, like the rhetoric is that they're set apart and they're different, they actually weren't that different. And this is a problem that is a cultural problem in the US, and I expect in like Western countries that have tended to be more Christian, or I mean, probably not just those, but in my experience, from what I know, since I haven't, been everywhere, but it is incredibly damaging, and it is really, it takes a lot of courage, even after leaving, to explore one's gender and sexuality. I am so grateful for my queer and trans people of color community. I feel like in the moments when I had no support network, those are the people who showed up for me and who have, helped me be housed, who have connected me with, because of all of the brainwashing and the trauma, I had experiences of being very disconnected from my body, which has led to illness and me getting sick and frequently like not even realizing that I was sick. I had an experience in Seattle when I lived there, of collapsing on the sidewalk outside of my workplace.
Oh my goodness.
And I was clearly not well, but I was so, because I was taught that the body is evil, and the body is, it's like, as a person in a assigned female earth body, like your body is a temptation. It is, if men lust, it's because something's wrong with my body. I'm not adorning it properly. It's because my body is inherently sinful and is inherently a temptation. And men are encouraged to blame women for, first of all, you can't stop your thoughts. That's actually not possible. And so as a result, like women and people, it's hard. I'm using binary gender because in this group, that is the only gender that's acknowledged. But I carried a lot of that kind of suspicion, like the habit of people like casting suspicion on me as somebody who's like, attractive, who I am not at all submissive. I'm not sure if you can tell. And so as far as like what is considered feminine and acceptable for like a woman in the Church of Christ, I did not fit that, and had a lot of anxiety about that growing up, and so became very disconnected from my body. And as a result, that has manifested in chronic illnesses. And I know I'm not the only one to have experienced that. So it has been a journey, even in that sense of just like becoming consciously connected to my body, so that I know when I'm sick and when I'm injured and when something's wrong, and learning to pay attention and to be able to ask for support, and to not feel like that's weakness, that actually interdependence is my value. I believe independence is a myth. There's no organism, species, plant in our ecosystem that is independent, that is just out here living on their own without being completely connected to every other species in the ecosystem. And humans have this mythology around independence, I think, especially Americans. And it's not actually true. And that is magnified in groups like this because of the nationalism. And it has a cascade effect to lots of different things, that can cause harm for people long term. Mm-hmm. So that's something that is an ongoing thing for me that I'm like working on, being like not dissociating. Part of that also is connected to, I'll, briefly mention, I had a lot of like repressed memories of abuse that I experienced in childhood that I feel like is condoned and covered up within the Church of Christ. And I know I'm not. I've spoken to other people who are born and raised in the group. And in the past couple of years, I have felt it's felt imperative for me to work on healing that, because it has been affecting my health. And I would notice that I would dissociate and, not know that I have, injured myself, or, and that it would be affecting my mental health, to the point that I became incapacitated and couldn't work, for an extended period of time. And I feel really grateful that I was able to come across somatics, that I have a wonderful community of like queer people of color who have supported me across the country, and who have done, I think, what the Church of Christ in some ways, in some ways they do well as far as like supporting each other within the group. But my feeling is that this should just be how society operates in general, that we should like give a damn about people, whether or not they believe the same thing as you, and that we should care about the well-being of the planet, and realize that we are all interdependent and connected. And so those kind of the ways that I saw that practiced within the group, some of it was really beautiful. There was this woman at one of the congregations who she potty trained at least half the kids in the congregation because she was just really good at it. And so parents had support like that when they were having trouble potty training their kids, and that's not something that just exists in the larger community. And so it is something that when you leave, you're like, wow, like I missed that. Or like, if someone lost their job, knowing that like people would make sure they didn't become homeless, or if you're sick, to know that people would bring food. All of these things are things I want to hold on to. I don't want to get rid of those things, but I just want to expand it and have it be more than just like this narrow group of people.
And non-conditional as well, conditional upon your status as a church member or your status within the LGBTQIA plus community, all of those things, just to make it non-conditional, support for everybody, support for just human beings and life in general.
Right. I'm like, this is how, there's a quote that I feel like perfectly sums up my feelings about it. And I do pull from my experience. I think it's really important for me in my deconstruction process not to just like throw out everything that I learned. Part of the reason that I'm an activist is because this is how I was raised, and I was reading these texts and seeing like Jesus flipping over tables in the temple because they were exploiting the poor, and me thinking like, yeah, like you should
go Jesus.
Yeah, like this is wrong, and we shouldn't be exploiting people. And whether that was actually practiced, in the group, what that, I would say that probably wasn't. But there's this quote by Adrienne Maree Brown. I actually have it like taped above my desk, and it says, "I have a vision of movement as sanctuary, not a tiny perfectionist utopia behind behind miles of barbed wire and fences and test and judgment and righteousness, but a vast sanctuary where our experiences as humans who have experienced and caused harm are met with centered, grounded invitations to grow, where winning is measured not just by the absence of patterns of harm, distrust, and isolation, but by the presence of healing and healthy interdependence, where we are skilled at being honest, setting and honoring boundaries, giving and receiving apologies, asking for help, and changing behaviors."
Wow.
And that's from her book, Adrienne Maree Brown's book, We Will Not Cancel Us. And it's written, kind of in response to cancel culture of like, when people do something wrong and they mess up, you just cancel them. And I don't support cancel culture in that way. And as an activist, I'm like, we have to be able to change and grow and allow people to make mistakes and to learn how to repair relationships. And that wasn't something that I learned in this group, but the kind of devotion to community is something that that is still a value. And that I want to, perhaps even in a peer support type of network, to be able to create and build with other folks, because our world needs it. It's something that's lacking in the larger society, which is why groups like this are appealing and why people don't leave them in large part.
To me, everything you've said there just sounds so perfect. And when people speak to me about the promise of a utopia or the promise of a better life, everything that you have said there would be enough to lull me into a high demand group or cult, because that sounds idealistic and perfect to me. And then I think to myself, how can there be people in this world that just don't want the best for everybody else? How are there people that, and everybody I speak to that comes and sits down with me and has these lengthy chats, we all share the same views and values. So I feel like there is definitely a common thread amongst advocates, allies, survivors, and people involved in these movements that just we all share the same traits, I think, that must make us vulnerable to these types of groups and exploitation and coercion. Because
maybe, but I think these are just human.
Just see the best.
I think they're human needs. I really do, and I don't think there's anything that's pathological about wanting the best for people. I certainly would be suspicious if a group came to me and they're like, "This is what we're doing. We figured it out." Like, one of the things that I love about Adrienne Maree Brown and like the emergent strategy community, that's kind of like the group of people. It's not a group. It's just like people. She wrote a book and it's like incredible. And I recommend it. But people who like that book and people who enjoy like Octavia Butler's literature, her sci-fi, people who enjoy things like Ursula Le Guin, people who enjoy things like generative fiction, and envisioning the world in a better situation than we have it right now. I think there are people who join groups like this because they believe that a group has figured it out. What I know after having been a part of a group like this is that no one has figured it out, because if they had, our world would look like a very different place. And that there are systems of oppression that are set up to prevent that ever from actually happening. And so if we do create, I think it's something that will emerge out of necessity, because things become unbearable. And that is why I left, because, there are a lot of benefits to being in this group. I would have never been homeless. I probably would have always had access to healthcare. The reason I left is because things became unbearable. And I think, at least as an activist, the larger society won't feel a compulsion to change and shift in these ways that we're talking about until it becomes unbearable. But there are small groups of us, especially, I think, survivors of cults, who have maybe seen a little glimpse of what things could be like, but seen it done really poorly and harmfully, that are like, something about this, they were onto something. It was done horribly, and it was incredibly traumatizing. And there is a legitimate human need for belonging and for cooperation and for collaboration and for healing and for support. Yeah, and community, that these groups tap into that desire and then manipulate it for something that's harmful. But the desire itself is not a problem. The desire itself is actually how humans have survived for millions of years, because we did learn how to collaborate and we did learn how to work together. Humans are not like, lions or like ferocious sort of predators. And the way that we survived was by collaborating and working together. And recently, I feel like in human history, we've forgotten that. And that's what makes these groups so dangerous, because there's a part of us that knows that that's what we need to survive. And I think these groups do a really good job. Groups like the Church of Christ and other groups that are coercive and authoritarian do a really good job of tapping into that instinct to cooperate and using it in a way that causes harm and traumatizes people and destroys families.
I am really looking forward to your ICSA talk. I think it's going to be incredible. If it's anything like what you said today, it's going to offer so much insight into some just much needed subject matter. And I think that there's nobody better to speak about it from what you've said today. And I know that we've missed out a lot. There's a lot that we haven't spoken about, but I feel like some of the other topics have kind of taken priority, and there's been a need to have those lengthy discussions, especially for potential listeners who may want to take parts of this conversation away and apply it to themselves in any way that they can. But one thing I did want to focus on before I ask you if there's anything you think we've missed, and to talk a little bit about your journey out of the group and advice you have for others, is so at the baptism and during the 5 steps that people must follow, they are asked, or told that they must repent publicly of any of their sins. And I feel like this almost lines up with some of the HIPAA violations that you spoke about in our communication. Yeah. So obviously, a lot of the time when we've spoken on the show, when people are told to publicly out themselves for things that they have done, which goes against doctrine or against principles and practices, it's often used as a method of control against somebody, collateral to keep them from leaving the group, a control method to make them feel ashamed and judged by the rest of the group, and all of these nefarious, horrible things that come with the practice of publicly shaming somebody. But then there are actual cases that you know of within the Church of Christ where people's personal information has actually been made available in ways that it shouldn't have been, violating some of their personal information. And I wondered if you could just talk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah. So when I was at Freed-Hardeman University, one of the first things that I did when I went there was go to the counseling office, because I knew that I needed support. Like I had been having mental health, like I've been having panic attacks, and I had not been allowed to access mental health support growing up. Like I did ask, but I was told, basically it was against, my parents weren't in support of that. And where you're just told that depression and anxiety is like a demonic attack, or like not having enough faith or whatever. So I went to the counseling office and I had one conversation. I don't even know if this person was a licensed therapist, but it was the person who was the director of the counseling office on campus. So the person that you needed to talk to in order to get any sort of counseling services. And I had one conversation with her, and the next thing I know, it may have been a week or two after that conversation that I had shared, that I was struggling with some doubt, that I was feeling depressed, understandably, because of, some of the things that I've shared that I experienced.
Absolutely.
And the next thing I know, my parents are at the school, and they are there to take me home, to like take me out of school. And I had no idea. I was completely blindsided. They didn't tell me that they were coming.
Oh,
they drove 14 hours to the campus, because that's how far away my like childhood, the place where I grew up, was from the school. And I didn't go with them. But what I later found out was that after I talked to the person who was head of the counseling office, she called the head of the honors college, who I was in the honors college at that school. And he called my parents, and she had called him and told him everything that I said. And then he called my parents and told them everything I said. And I guess had recommended that they like come. And I don't think he had recommended they come take me out of school, but that was what my parents took away from it. And I know of at least two other people who that happened to. Thankfully for me, it was just the one session. But that not only violated HIPAA, but also FERPA, which is like the federal law that protects education privacy and confidentiality. It's a law that says that, if you're in college, your parents can't call and just get your grades or like find out anything about your school unless you've given consent. And I had not given consent. These other people hadn't given consent. And one of the people that I knew, it was going on for so long, like she was seeing the same counselor, and the counselor would call after every single session and tell her parents everything that she said.
Goodness.
Yeah. And she didn't know for months.
That is such an awful violation.
Yeah. Huge violation of privacy, betrayal, and a, breaking of the law.
Absolutely.
As well.
And also, as you said, that left a bad taste in your mouth, and it took you a while to decide to try speaking to a professional again, or I would say professional in air quotes, because that person has obviously not acted in a professional capacity whatsoever.
Right.
But you ended up in such a bad place that you were almost forced into going to find somebody that could help you find a way to manage the situation that you were in. And perhaps you may not have had to go back to that place or to even enter that difficult period had you not been scared away from speaking to somebody in that capacity in the first place. And on top of that, I'm pretty sure it's compulsory or mandatory for a lot of further education bodies to have a service that provides some type of well-being support, like the counselling services you've mentioned. So if that was not a mandatory part of education in some parts of the world, it doesn't even sound like it would exist in that particular college that you're talking about, because they obviously don't take it seriously enough to treat it with any kind of respect.
No, I think it was more like a surveillance mechanism more so than absolutely. It was. Yeah, it wasn't meant to be therapeutic or like helpful.
That is just, there's so many things that we've talked about today that are so problematic with this movement. And of course, things may have changed since you were there. And I really do hope that they have, because it's difficult to sit here and think about other people that may be going through the same experiences, whether they are struggling with their identity in terms of sexuality or gender, whether they are struggling with their identity culturally and because of their heritage and the color of their skin, whether people are struggling because of mental health. And as you've talked about, the Church of Christ just doesn't believe in science. People being denied mainstream education or some kind of structural education. There are so many things that we've spoken about that are important to highlight and to discuss and to bring to the attention of other people. And I do hope that things have progressed and changed, because it's quite scary to think about people experiencing these things. But also, as we've said time and time again throughout this entire interview, the Church of Christ really isn't unique in its principles and practices to the larger picture. There may be a few things that they do differently that sets them aside from other movements, but overall, generally, they are not doing things that have never been explored before or never been heard of before. So there must be millions of people following these practices of these captive organizations and high demand faiths that are experiencing all of the things that we have discussed today. And that to me is just overwhelming. Like, where do you even begin to help or change or I don't know. It's just, and a lot of these people won't even have access to any kind of information that could teach them that things are different or things can be different, or that their faith is exactly the same as the other denomination that's existing 2 blocks away. And it's overwhelming when you think about it. But
one of the good things recently that has come out of the COVID situation is, and this is not just true for the Church of Christ, but the lockdowns gave people a break from the constant indoctrination. And the Church of Christ has been hemorrhaging members since the lockdown started. And I can't say I'm unhappy to hear that. There has been, at least like on the Reddit group, an influx of people who stopped going during lockdown, had a moment to be like, wait, what am I like? Do I want to keep being a part of this group? And then chose not to go back. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're deconstructing, in the sense that they're questioning all of the beliefs, but it has given people some breathing room. And then there's also the internet, which, for most of my life that we've discussed up till now, like of course, as an adult, there was the internet, but growing up, I didn't necessarily have access to like Google or whatever. And so now I am hopeful that because there is internet and social media and podcasts like this, and these docuseries that exist, those were super helpful actually for me, listening to other people's stories and hearing how similar their experiences were to mine, for me to start thinking like, I think this is true. This person who told me I was in a cult, I think they're right, and so I feel hopeful about that, at least.
And I suppose this is a good opportunity for me to ask, before we move on to the last questions. But for me, who is a white person, what is the correct terminology for me to use when speaking about community groups that include people of color? Is that the right way to word it? What is the most appropriate way to address and speak about community groups, so that I can make sure I am adopting all of those things in further interviews?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. I think it kind of depends on the person. So my inclination is to ask, especially if the person is a person of color, Black, like brown, immigrant of color, to ask them how they refer to themselves, or how they would like to be called. There are so many different terms, and people can feel sensitive about how they are referred to. And so for me, I tend to use the term bodies of color, because it is ultimately our bodies that people are responding to. And, our bodies are what is being discriminated against. It doesn't really have anything to do with our culture, because most of the time when we're experiencing some sort of like othering or discrimination, people haven't even gotten the chance to know us. And our cultures are not monolithic. I consider myself very Southern, but not every Black person in the United States is Southern. There are people who grew up in other parts of the country. So that would be I mean, that's how I've moved through spaces. And, I certainly don't know everything. I know a lot about my own experience, but, one of the things that I have experienced is feeling a really deep kinship with people who are refugees and asylees to the US, because they have had the experience of leaving their life behind and having to reconstruct a new life. And I found that just even without trying or without intending to, a lot of them, I have a lot of friends who are refugees and immigrants, and I've learned a lot from them, and I've had to be corrected about, how I refer to them, or like biases that I have been taught. And so the biggest thing is just being open and knowing that no one knows everything, and we're all works in progress and learning, and just like being willing to like hear what other people desire, like what works for them as far as how they would like to be referred to. And that goes for gender and sexuality and all of those other kinds of identity as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for clearing that up. It's always a difficult thing to navigate, wanting to be person-centered and ensuring that every person is treated as an individual. But of course, the ways that we are brought up and the cultures that we grow up in are always going to play a part in the way that we categorize people and group people together and stop seeing people as individuals. So I just wanted to ask about that, and just to ask people how they would like to be referred to, if a label needs to be applied at all, which might not always be the case, then to just ask them, and the person will tell you. So that's great. Thank you for that. So my last question for you this evening, even though, as I said, there's like a whole load of things that we didn't even go over. And it's to ask you what advice you would have for other people who are also in high demand religious groups or thinking about leaving or have left. What advice you would have for them in their own healing journeys, and what they can do to empower themselves, to increase their interdependence, and to navigate life outside of a captive organization.
That is such a loaded question. I in reflecting on this, which I have done a lot because my entire family is still in the group. I don't know if I said that. And I'm no contact with my family, so I don't go back for funerals, weddings, births, any of that sort of thing. So for folks who might be in the non-institutional Church of Christ or the Church of Christ or any group like that, my best advice is to question everything. And this is definitely speaking from my experience. I know it sounds terrifying to question everything because I went through it. And I remember I was in college and was sharing with a friend that I was having some doubts and I had a lot of questions. And I even remember growing up, I got kicked out of Sunday school a couple of times for asking too many questions.
That doesn't surprise me.
It sounds very me. And that friend said to me after I expressed, doubts and having questions, they were like, don't think about it too much. You might think yourself out of your faith. And that surprised me so much because I just remember feeling like I don't want to have a faith that's so fragile I can't think about it. I can't build a life on something that flimsy. And sometimes questions do lead to more questions. But that's like a part of the adventure of life. And at least me, I desire to live my life deeply and authentically and vulnerably, and to live my life in connection with other people and with the earth. And in order to do that, I have to ask questions, and I have to be open to whatever answers emerge. And I have to be willing to sit with discomfort as well. And be willing to admit that I don't know, that sometimes there isn't a clear answer. And I think that is one of the most challenging things. And if you have especially been born and raised in a group like this, is that they present everything as like very black and white, as like everything being certain. And it's hard, even if can feel terrifying to admit that you don't know. But I've never regretted asking questions before, and I wouldn't trade that false certainty that I had in the Church of Christ ever for the freedom and the not self-knowledge, the deep self-knowledge that I have now. And I guess if people are on that journey, or they're looking to start the journey, to, start asking questions, and just to know that you're in good company, of many people before you and alongside you who are also asking these questions and sitting with discomfort and healing from having had the wrong answer to these questions at some point in the past and having experienced harm from that. So yeah, that's what I would say. And I even will say, like, if folks have questions like that and they want to have conversations, especially folks who are from the Churches of Christ, and especially if they're like people of color and queer people, like, I love having conversations like this. I love questions. It's really my jam. And I enjoy supporting people and like holding space for really big questions that sometimes can feel too big to hold by yourself. So folks can feel free to reach out to me.
Absolutely. If anybody would like Evvie's email address or to reach out, then you can get in touch with me, and I will then email Evvie, reach out to them, and we can connect people together. So get in touch, and thank you so much for everything that you've talked about with us today. Thank you for giving us insight into your experiences, especially because they have been so raw and vulnerable and connected to you as a person and an individual, and an overview of the religion and the movement itself as well, and how it may be impacting other individuals. And I feel like that is the greatest thing that we can do on this show: give an overview of the entire movement, but also then narrow it down to personal experiences that people have actually lived through, because then it's real. It's not just me reading off some facts about the start date of a church and some of the things that they believe in. You know, these are things that have actually happened, may still be happening to other people. And of course, we've highlighted some things that are of extreme importance around marginalized community groups, not just within faith-based movements, but in the world in general. These marginalized community groups that exist all around us every day, that may be more susceptible to exploitation and coercion because they are living on the fringes. And I feel like that's so important to look at and to discuss as well. And I cannot wait for your ICSA talk. It's in June, is that right?
I think it's in July. It's either June or July. It's in the summer.
But as soon as there is a link for the event, I will share it so everybody can tune in if they would like to watch it, with the International Cultic Studies Association. Very important work that they do at the ICSA conferences, and the research and people that they have attending the conference. And as I said before, I think you're an absolutely perfect candidate to go and speak about the bodies of color in the cult survivor space, and I really, really look forward to it. So thank you so much, Evvie, for your time today, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you, Evvie. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can reach me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.